So let's take a trip down something resembling a memory lane, but really is filled with so many potholes it's incredible. Anyway, the year is 1994. Capcom just released a fighter called X-Men Children of the Atom. It was marginally popular, and it spawned a sequel called Marvel Superheroes, which was slightly more marginally popular, and then nobody cared. And that's why we got X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and the rest. Like I said, something resembling a memory lane, but it's really full of potholes, so take that for what it's worth. Somewhere along the way, these games got ports. Capcom ported Marvel Superheroes over to the PlayStation and Sega Saturn consoles. Both ports were released in 1997. Meanwhile, X-Men Children of the Atom was ported by Probe Entertainment and Acclaim, and was released shortly thereafter. Figured that one out because I've long since given up. So to make a long story short, mainly because I've already touched on this story, the PlayStation version of X-Men was a sluggishly botched conversion that wasn't very fun to play, which is a stark contrast from the original arcade game that it was based on, which was very much a joy to play. Until the sequel came along, that is. Capcom's port of Marvel's Superheroes, on the other hand, is only somewhat better than Acclaim's abysmal efforts, but even somewhat better is, well, better than irradiated Hulk manure. Marvel Superheroes is a very loose adaptation of the early Marvel's comic saga, the Infinity Gauntlet, which involves a bunch of superheroes fighting the diabolical Thanos and involved powerful things called Infinity Gems. How's that for descriptive? Somewhere along the way, in addition to fighting the few supervillains to make the cut, the heroes also decide to beat the crap out of each other in order to collect the Infinity Gems that grants the wielder different powers depending on the gem. I guess the comics did a better job of explaining it. It's been decades since I last read the damn things. Although the overall storyline is something of a throwaway, the Infinity Gems do play a role in actual gameplay, as you can collect these gems and use their powers to give yourself a much needed edge over your opponent. Each gem offers specific enhancements for a short period of time, whether it be increased strength, quicker speed, better resistance, elemental projectile attacks, or even health regeneration. Not only that, but when a fighter uses a specific gem, they may get an additional ability or two. So if you're playing as Spider-Man, for example, and you have the power gem and you use it, then Ben Reilly will appear behind your opponent and mimic your attacks, which is a somewhat useful ability to have. Likewise, if Blackheart were to use the reality gem, then in addition to the elemental projectile attacks he gets as default, he'll briefly turn invisible, which is nice. Although the gems could be written off as something of a gimmick that never saw the light of day beyond this one game, I find the gems to be something of an interesting addition that adds a bit of variety and an additional element to the overall gameplay. Knowing which gem works best with your fighter of choice can be a helpful boost to your offensive options, and even the individual gems can boost your chances, or your score if you retain any gems unused in victory. Setting aside the addition of the gems, Marvel Superheroes follows the basic play mechanics of its X-Men predecessor and refines it somewhat. Each of the 10 Marvel characters, including some returning X-people from the previous X game, have the usual array of special moves as well as a super combo or two that can be executed whenever you manage to fill your super meter. Depending on the fighter, you can store up to 3 full meters of super energy to be used at any time. There's only 2 modes of play in Marvel Superheroes, your usual arcade and versus modes. Not much to it, but you can save your settings and high scores to a memory card, which isn't much but more than what you got in the previous entry. When it comes to portovers from arcade source to PlayStation, Marvel Superheroes is a considerable improvement over its predecessor. The overall speed and pacing of the action is almost consistent with that of the arcade original, although there are some bouts of slowdown that will prop up every so often, especially when fighting a larger opponent like Hulk or Juggernaut. But even then, there never comes a point where you're playing a game and it's running so sluggishly, you're scared the frickin' thing might crap out and die right before your eyes. The game runs at a smooth, solid pace. You've got your 10 Marvel characters with all their movesets and combos and stuff intact. Stuff that you could pull off without a hitch if you know how. Control is pretty solid and responsive. Moves execute without a hitch for the most part, and outside a few instances of slowdown which might mess with the timing a bit, you shouldn't have too much of a problem pulling off moves. If you know how to do those moves, of course. The arcade Marvel Superheroes game was a visually impressive beast from an artistic standpoint, with clean, animated characters fighting in front of lush, colorful, and eye-popping battle arenas. It's one of those games that look about as good today as it did 2 decades ago because everything fits together. Nothing felt out of place or rehashed despite a couple returning characters. It blended nicely together and it just works visually. With this PlayStation version, the overall visual quality has been retained to a near flawless degree. There isn't a loss of color or detail when it comes to the vibrant and exquisite exquisite backgrounds and they look amazing even on this reduced version. Even the various fighters retain their size and detail and look pretty damn good for the most part. As expected, however, animation is missing a few frames here and there, so there might be instances where action might seem a bit choppy, and when it slows down it gets pretty painful visually, but generally speaking, it's still a pretty looking fighter. But not a pretty fighter. Okay, never mind. Sound quality is actually quite decent for the most part. It's basically the actual arcade music and sound effects ported over with little to no effort whatsoever. And it all sounds pretty good for the most part. The game's rather catchy and memorable soundtrack loops properly this time around rather than play off a CD like the previous game, so that's a plus. Sound effects are crisp, clear, and most of it is accounted for. The impacts, the grunts, the voice bites, the explosions, the stuff. It's pretty much there and it sounds great. In spite of some slowdown and barebone gameplay modes, Marvel Super Heroes turned out pretty well on the PlayStation, all things considered. The gameplay is fairly consistent, control is responsive, it's nowhere near as sluggish as the X-Men rubbish on the same console, and it's probably the closest you're going to get to having an almost but not quite accurate adaptation of its arcade original on the PlayStation, especially when you consider that once they start getting into the X-Men vs Street Fighter or Marvel vs Capcom stuff, they would have to considerably strip those versions down to accommodate the limited PlayStation capabilities. Not to mention this one got the Infinity Gems gimmick, which always makes for interesting fights on the multiplayer front. So yeah, if you're into 90s Marvel and are looking for a decent PS1 fighter, then Marvel Super Heroes should fit the bill nicely for a couple quick games or so.